contract that they presented Zelensky with and said he had an hour or two to sign for 50% of Ukraine's current and unknown future mineral resources. So first of all, this is a country that was never particularly well off to begin with, that's been completely devastated both physically and economically by 3 years of being subjected to a total war by its much bigger neighbor. And then the US demands, with no security guarantees attached, just we demand it for notional repayment of an amount that the US president kind of came up with on a piece of paper. Incidentally, on that 40 billion point that President Trump raised of the money that's supposedly been quote unquote invested in Ukraine, again, it really is worth mentioning this. Firstly, that number includes notional valuing of a vast amount of equipment that was derelict or considered surplus in US long-term storage that would eventually the US would have had to pay to dismantle, which, by the way, is not cheap, that was notionally valued to comply with the Presidential Drawdown Authority legislation to enable it to be transferred. And so a huge amount of that notional 40 billion was equipment that the US was going to have to pay to dispose of in long-term storage, that it got rid of and got huge service from as the US interests in terms of writing down a key strategic adversary. Secondarily, the stuff that was actually paid for in terms of new equipment for Ukraine, or equipment from active stock that then needed to be replaced, which constitutes a certainly significant sum, but by no means that all of, or even the majority of that 340 billion. The vast majority of that new spending, as it were, was spent in American factories with American jobs going back into the American economy. It was not sent to Ukraine. It's been spent in factories all across America, producing everything from Bradley through howitzer barrels, through air defense ammunition, So again, this idea that the US has been sending loads of taxpayer money to the Ukrainians is just not true.
This war could have been avoided if we, the West, led by the United States, had responded appropriately after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, if we had responded appropriately after they invaded Ukraine in 2014. And that's not a game. I mean, the whole world saw Russia invade Ukraine in 2014. And we did nothing when they jumped over the Obama red line in Syria. So this war is a result of failed deterrence. And trying to explain deterrence and spend money for deterrence is always a tough sell, because you have to convince taxpayers and voters and legislators of what the risk is and why you have to do it. That's hard, but it is much, much cheaper, obviously, to do that, to have successful deterrence, as we did for over 70 years after the Second World War, versus dealing with the failed deterrence we're dealing with right now. I think that for Andrew, I would just offer, as I'm pretty sure you know this, the amount of money, the 120 to 180 billion, depending on what you include in that amount, it's clearly not 350, but the amount of money that the United States has spent or contributed towards helping Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of that money was spent in the United States. It's not pallets of ammunition, of money that are loaded onto a C-17 and then delivered into Ukraine. It's money that is spent replacing or buying ammunition, refurbishing old equipment that is then loaned or given to Ukraine. And of course, there are no U.S. troops in Ukraine except for those officers that are assigned to the embassy and the Office of Defense Cooperation, whose task is to make sure accountability of every javelin, every artillery round, every set of binoculars. Oh, you can shake your head if you want to. That's a fact.